Kerry Morse, Conservation Awards Manager with the National Forest Foundation, and I'm here to talk about our Matching Awards grant program. Just quickly, a little bit of background about the National Forest Foundation. We are a nonprofit. We're the leading organization working on behalf of the American public to inspire meaningful connections to our national forests, and we work in partnership with the Forest Service nationwide. We do this for the same reason that we are all in the room here today, because we believe these lands are an American treasure. We work a number of different ways. Grant programs is one of them, but we also do our own direct work at forest sites across the country. We have a large tree planting program working to plant 50 million trees on the national forests. We do constituency building and capacity building and a lot of facilitation work. And we also work directly with the public to get folks inspired and involved. And if you don't have it on your calendar yet, National Forest Week is the second week of July this year. So through our conservation awards programs, our grant programs, we've funded over 2,300 projects now nationwide. And for those projects, provided 80 million in grant funds to partner organizations who are the ones that truly get the credit for the conservation outcomes here, and bring in that leverage that brings more to our grant funds and has conservation outcomes in the $250 million range. Focusing in on our Matching Awards program, this is our one competitive grant program at this time. And it funds one-year projects that at the end of that grant period have on-the-ground outcomes on the national forest. So the funds for this program come through the Forest Service, and all projects have to benefit the National Forest System. And I think, as I mentioned, it's a nationwide grant program, so forests nationwide are eligible. The program has two focus areas for funding priorities. One we call forest health, the other one we call outdoor experiences. Some forest health related projects, this is basically ecosystem health. So wetland restoration projects fall under this category, tree planting, removal of invasive species, those types of projects. In the outdoor experiences realm, there's all the recreation infrastructure projects, the trail clearing, system maintenance, building bridges and drainage structures, as well as engaging people in the experience of being on the forest. So engaging volunteers or kids doing work would all fall under that category. Of course, these focus areas are not distinct, and that overlap area we call integrated projects that integrate both of them. And that's the sweet spot if you're sending a proposal into the Matching Awards program. And so the projects like that would be ones that have a forest health outcome and also an outdoor experiences component. So bringing in volunteers, such as this one pictured, building beaver dam analogs, also doing invasive species control in wilderness areas with volunteers. Projects like that really rise to the top in this program. As you might assume from the name of the program, match is a big part of it. We are looking for a one-to-one non-federal cash match for this program. And to break that down, any project that's being proposed here, it needs to have, in a simplified scenario, half funded by non-federal sources, so foundation funding or donor funding. And then with that half funding, the NFF can make a MAP award of federal funds that covers the other half of the project. There are more complex scenarios, but that's the core of the one-to-one match requirement. Timing-wise, this is our most reliable grant program. We have 2 application opportunities every year. And in recent years, these have been with proposals due in January and June. We have an open award period right now with applications due on June 9th. In terms of the grant period, timing is a one-year grant period. So those funded in round one, that grant period starts in March of that year and runs through March of the following year. Those will be funding in round two, start in August or September and run for a year. So for this upcoming funding round, I'm expecting that we will award up to about $500,000. And the proposals we see, the budgets vary widely. In the past years, we've seen proposals for a $5,000 project up to about $50,000 or $60,000 or $65,000. The vast majority we see are under $25,000. So doing the math there, that's looking at about 15 or a couple more grants going out this round. Last year, we funded about 2/3 of the proposals we saw. In previous years, it's more like half of the proposals get funded. So this is a fairly competitive grant round. The difference in 2020, I think, was due to the pandemic and receiving fewer proposals. So that is the very quick overview of the Matching Awards program. We have a lot more information on our website, including the full RFP and an hour-long webinar. If you're not getting questions answered there, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to talk. So thank you.
And we'll move on to Dusty.
Okay, so I'm going to speak to you about the Wilderness Stewardship Performance Funding provided by the USDA Forest Service. This is a slide here of what we call the Wilderness Stewardship Performance Table of Elements. For you, those of you not familiar with what WSP, Wilderness Stewardship Performance is, I urge you to tune into the WSP presentation that's going to be starting at the top of the next hour. Basically, it is a framework the Forest Service utilizes to track management actions taken to preserve wilderness character, our primary mandate under the Wilderness Act. I want to stress that local ranger districts, forests, and regions, as well as our partners, contribute much more to WSP than what I will be sharing here. My data on funding is only limited to what is known as National Priority Project Funds, which are divided among programs at the Washington office, the agency's headquarters in DEC, as well as an amount off the top that we were able to help be allocated to the field units. So typically at the national level, we allocate about $2.5 million to wilderness stewardship performance projects. And we use two venues for that, an internal funding process and an external funding process. You will note here that in 2021, there was a 40% reduction in the amount of funding we got. And that was due to the budget modernization process, which I'll talk to you about here a little bit more. Some of you may be familiar with the internal process, as it was recently moved to the SurveyMonkey Apply platform with the help of the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance a couple of rounds ago. And this helps us to manage the project data for communicating the importance of the funding and the completions to our agency leadership. In fact, the data that's coming to us through these applications was critical, there we go, to our ability to pivot with the new budget direction we received from Congress, that we would no longer be able to fund salary and related expenses out of our project funds, which has had a different impact for each region. For example, most units in the northern region utilize the funding for hiring and paying of agency seasonal employees. And these could no longer be funded out of this pot of money under this new budget direction. However, units in the southern region typically utilize partnership agreements to get the work done, and they were able to continue with little to no adjustments. This regional variation in partnership availability and ability differs across the nation, as I'm sure Randy with the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance here can discuss further if folks are curious. So the ideal schedule for our internal funding program involves opening the application process in the fall before the implementation year, so that the Chiefs Wilderness Advisory Group has time to review and rate each proposal, with each regional representative rating all the proposals from their home region, plus a random assortment from other regions, ensuring that each proposal gets 2 ratings, one from the local rep and one from someone outside their region. These scores are then sorted in order from highest to lowest, and we go down the list until we run out of available funding. The potential funded versus unfunded lists are then shared with the regional offices for them to review and rank to their order of priority. These lists finally come back to the Washington office for review to help, and then we help distribute the funding across the regions as fairly as possible based on this ranking and the ranking of priorities by the regional office. Our hope is to have all of this sorting and selecting finished no later than the summer before the fiscal year of implementation, so that we can work with our budget staff to allocate the funds to each region at the start of the fiscal year and include the selection information into budget direction to the field. Recently, regional offices have been advised that they can shift funding from these selections to other priorities within the region as the regional forester needs. And we've only seen a significant change in the funding allocation to the field from one region back in 2019. Otherwise, the funding has been typically allocated generally to the regional office and then to the forest as indicated in the selection. Our goal, again, is to have the entire application selection and funding application process completed by October 1st each year so that the field units can begin work immediately and meet any contracting, agreement, hiring, or budgeting deadlines as needed. Unfortunately, the application window for FY22 has not opened yet due to a great deal of budget uncertainty related to the budget modernization and the funding of salaries and related expenses. And I do not know when this application will open at this time, but be sure we will make an announcement. So our external funding pot, we have a partnership agreement with the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance, which Randy will probably touch on here in a bit. And we were able to typically put about $200,000 each year into an agreement with NWSI. And we see typically a doubling to a quadrupling of that funding to that process. And those funds go to partners across the nation as well. So overall, with both of these programs, we've been able to get funding from the Washington office to nearly all of our units through both funding programs, about 90% of our units, 402 out of the 448. And we've been able to track how the funding improves management actions to preserve wilderness character. This middle blue line here represents the average wilderness stewardship performance score, remember tracking management actions, across all 448 U.S. Forest Service wilderness areas. Those few units that have not received funding, either from not applying or consistently scoring low, vacancies, or a host of other reasons, there's definitely, they are scoring lower than the average, right? And then the units that have received funding every year since 2015 are overall above the mean score. And again, a disclaimer, this data is based solely on what the Washington office gets in our priority project funds that goes to the field. The regions, the forests, and the districts contribute, and our partners contribute a lot more than just these dollars that I'm able to track, especially when it comes to volunteer hours, and the partnership work that's going on out there. And I'll be happy to answer any wilderness stewardship performance funding questions at the end of this session.
There are currently no questions. Oh, wait, here we go. I must say that despite the longer lead time, the new procedure for having WSP internal funds available at the beginning of the fiscal year is much, much better than what was done several years ago. We now have enough time to get the projects done and money spent. I think a lot of folks on this call and that know the WSP program would agree with that.
Perfect, great. And that was a recommendation from Chief Tidwell. So glad that it's working.
Okay. All right, well, Dusty, I was hoping you'd use this as the announcement of the FY22 WSP proposal window, but I guess I'll have to be more patient. So thanks, Dusty. And I'm going to hand it over to Randy. Randy, take it away.
I'm Randy Welch, the Executive Director for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. Pleasure to be here today with you and congratulate you on having a great National Wilderness Skills Institute week. Today, I'd like to talk about the funding programs that the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance provides through a challenged cost share with the Forest Service, primarily our Wilderness Stewardship Performance Partner Funding and our National Forest Trail System Stewardship Partner Funding. Now, the partnership funding that we provide goes to the partner groups, the nonprofits that are participating with and helping the National Forest employees complete work on the National for us, both for wilderness stewardship work and for National Forest Trails work. The third program we have, I really won't talk about, is our Boots on the Ground grants. So these is when we have available funding special to NWSA, we will sometimes offer a special Boots on the Ground grant program for equipment supplies to our nonprofit organizations. So let's dig into the wilderness stewardship performance funding. As Dusty has set the stage, wilderness stewardship performance is that suite of activities that the agency does to complete wilderness stewardship. And our focus in this program is, of course, increasing the scores, trying to either maintain them or improving them. And I've got information on these slides for our last year of selection, 2021. Our program typically solicits project proposals in January through March, and then we make selections by the end of April, and people are beginning to do their work in May through the rest of the calendar year. Typical project that comes in is usually suggesting between 6 and 8 points will be improved for a particular wilderness. And of course, all the work has to be done in a national forest wilderness area. A cash match is required, and we'll typically see at least 1-to-1. Sometimes we'll have up to 2-to-1, and then overall, we typically are going to be 3-to-1. It's a great slide, Dusty. I'd like to have you share that with me at some point in time. We're finding that our partner organizations provide excellent project opportunities, and we're still, we are seeing that they are getting a lot of great work done on the National Forest. I think it's probably both internal and external. There's still a little bit of misunderstanding about what some of the WSP elements scoring is all about. And that's something we're going to need to work with the Forest Service on to tighten that up in the future. As you look at what we see for our typical projects, our range runs from about $2,000 to $3,000 up to $15,000. This last year we had one project that was a little bit over budget, but we had funding, so we went ahead and provided for that. See, the average project is right around $10,000 that's proposed. Cash match usually also comes in around $10,000 or better. In-kind matches, where we're really seeing the great increase with that 2-to-1 is coming in close to $22,000 to $25,000. We're seeing a lot of people involved, and that's the great role that the wilderness stewardship performance funding provides, is engaging your partner groups and getting people on the ground from the partner groups and from volunteers that they bring out to the National Forest. And you can see that we're providing a fairly good increase in scoring for each of the projects. This last year, of the $242,000 that we had available, we were able to fund 25 projects, and we'll typically fund anywhere between 20 and 25 projects per year based on that available funding. Our projects are balanced across the regions. As you can see, we were able to fund all the projects that were submitted this last year. So we had a good cross section around the regions, with the exception of Region 8. And I'm not sure exactly why we didn't get any proposals from Region 8. It may be because Region 8 does a lot of partner work with their internal WSP program, and so people may have focused there instead of coming to the NWSA program. All the information about our WSP program is found at wildernessalliance.org, where you can find fact sheets, program information, the news release, and selected project information from previous years. Our other program that we're really proud of is our National Forest System Trail Stewardship Partner Funding, which is putting people out on work on the National Forest Trail System. This program applies both to wilderness and non-wilderness trails, both motorized and non-motorized. But I am pleased that a fairly large component of this funding is going towards wilderness trails. The purpose of this program is to support the National Trail Stewardship Act, which has two goals. One, to increase trail maintenance on the national forest, as well as engage volunteers and double the number of people involved on the National Forest Trail System. And we run this program in partnership with other national trails organizations, American Trails, American Hiking Society, Backcountry Horsemen of America, International Mountain Bicycle Association, the National Off-Highway Vehicle Conservation Council, and the American Motorcyclist Association. Each of the groups provides a rater reviewer for looking at the proposals, and we make joint decisions, unanimous decisions about which projects to fund. And again, to provide balance across the trail system and across user types. In 2021, we had 92 projects that were submitted. Again, the time period is January to March for project solicitation, selections in April, and then people start working in May. We had over $500,000 this year, 547, but we had $1 million in requests. So there's still a large unmet demand of projects that are out there. We were able to generate over $1 million in cash match, and we think about $2.5 million in-kind contributions, so a 6-to-1 return on investment. Well, we expect to have over 6,700 volunteers and staff of these nonprofits engaged this year, and over 2,700 miles of trail will be maintained. A pretty good program. As you can see some specifics here, the typical project comes in at about $11,000 or $12,000. They typically have, at least 1-to-1 or often 2-to-1 in terms of cash match. The in-kind match is usually 3 or 4-to-1. The average is a little skewed this year because one project came in at 600 miles, but typically they're going to be between 30 and 50 miles of trail on each of these projects at a fairly decent cost per mile, and involving a large number of people, usually through volunteer work days, weekends, and some extended work trips. Again, you can see from the selection of projects across the country, we have great representation across the region and a pretty good balance of funding. The exception being in Alaska, where we only had one project usually submitted each year. And in this year, the project just didn't make the cut, was deemed not to be sufficient size or to be warranted for funding. But all the other projects around the country, pretty good balance and pretty good representation. And as you can see here, as you look at some of the key statistics, what I want you to note is the percent of proposed selected per pot of the projects. We picked up nearly all of the benefits that were being proposed in terms of cash match, in-kind match, number of volunteers, staff and crew, and miles trail maintained. Of all of the projects that were submitted, we picked up nearly 80% or better of the amounts that were being proposed. So for the amount of money we had, we got the most efficient projects, the best qualified projects in our mix for selection. So we're pretty proud of that. Again, the information about the program can be found on our website at wildernessalliance.org. And we'll look forward to seeing many of you submit projects next year in 2022, all based on funding availability. Well, I still got just 1 minute. We'll put a commercial out here that while the NWSI has been great for getting a lot of training, our next face-to-face workshop is planned in November in Roanoke, Virginia, for our National Wilderness Workshop, which we hope we'll see a lot of people attend. Our theme is advocating for stewardship, the tips, the tools, and practical techniques for the wilderness steward. We'll be in Roanoke November 15th through 18th, and a special component of the workshop this year is a special advocacy training trip to Washington, D.C., where we'll be meeting with agency officials, do committee briefings, and have some hill visits. So it's a chance for people in the stewardship community to learn the art and practice of stewardship advocacy, which is different than designation advocacy. And as part of that training, we're going to be hosting a series of webinars throughout the summer as a precursor, as a build up to the actual event. And there'll be more information coming out through the Friday field notes and through special announcements from NWSA. We look forward to seeing most of you there. So thank you.
Thanks, Randy. We don't have any questions. Oh, here's a question real quick. How can we make a project that involves trails that are in extremely bad shape competitive for a trail stewardship grant? Such projects don't get much mileage.
And that is one of the downsides. Our program, because we're trying to focus on the Trail Stewardship Act, increasing the number of trail miles maintained, our focus really is on maintenance, not on spot improvements. But if you can somehow package your project so that it includes both the improvement work for that small section as well as some additional trail miles, it can be competitive. We do have some projects that are small scale in scope. It all depends on, again, the balance within the region, the cost efficiency of the project itself, the cash match that's brought forward, the in-kind match that might result as well. So a small project can be competitive, but it has to have all the other elements clicking to be fund worthy in this particular program.
Thanks, Randy. And I hope to be able to hit the road in November to join you guys in Roanoke. We'll wait and see how travel stuff shakes free. So thanks for that presentation. And we're going to move on to Sharon.
My name is Sharon Seim. I'm the Wilderness and Trails Program Manager for the Alaska region. I sit in Juneau, Alaska. And I also am a co-lead for all things having to do with the Great American Outdoors Act in my region. And that's why I was asked today to talk about this funding source and how it might relate to wilderness and wild and scenic river resources. So real quickly, an overview of the Great American Outdoors Act. It was bipartisan legislation that was passed last August, and it has two primary components. The first is that it fully funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund. This is something that people have been wanting for years, and it finally came about. LWCF primarily invests in the conservation and recreation opportunities on public and private lands, primarily through acquisitions of properties or interest in properties, such as an easement. And I am not going to spend any more time talking about LWCF today. The other component of this legislation is that it established the Public Parks and Public Lands Legacy Restoration Fund, which the Act calls the fund. And that's where we will spend our time. So the main thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the fund is that this is about deferred maintenance of existing assets and infrastructure. It's about a $2 billion fund in each of 5 years. The lion's share of the money is going to the National Park Service, but there are 6 agencies in total that are eligible to receive this funding. 5 with the Department of Interior, which are the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then in the Department of Agriculture, it's the U.S. Forest Service, and we receive 15% of the fund each year, or about $285 million. This is a 5-year program extending from 2021 to 2025. So again, the focus is on existing assets. These are things like campgrounds and roads and bridges and trails, things that are fixed. These are known infrastructure assets. This is less about dispersed recreation. The other thing is that the fund provides the majority of the dollars to projects that are called non-transportation. So it's easier to explain what transportation is. Transportation are roads, road bridges, and paved parking. For the purposes of the Great American Outdoors Act, trails are considered to be non-transportation assets. So the kinds of projects that qualify for this funding source are projects that fix sites and facilities. There is the potential to decommission or remove facilities that are no longer meeting public needs, but it has to be done within the context of deferred maintenance. So let's say you have a cabin and it has a leaky roof and you didn't get around to maintaining that. And now the water's running down the side of the building and it's damaged the bunkhouses and the flooring, and now the foundation is heaving. So we may be better off to actually raise that cabin and start again. That might be a more cost-effective way to address that deferred maintenance. Typically, this funding is not about new assets. However, you can put forward projects that expand, enhance, improve, and add on to existing facilities. So for instance, maybe you have a site that's been loved to death and it was never designed for the number of people or the type of use that it's now getting. So maybe we need to change the trail class from a level 1 to a level 3 trail. Maybe we need to add some bathrooms or a pavilion to a pull-off site or a day use area that's now getting a lot of use. But primarily this is about deferred maintenance of existing. So on projects, you need to ask, does it fix something or is it addressing a safety problem? The key focus of this legislation is on improving visitor experience and access, including accessibility. The Act also has a focus on economic benefits. Will this provide jobs and revenue into the future? Jobs before, during, and after construction? Will more people, will there be more economic opportunities, such as with outfitters and guides or concessionaires, or maybe indirect benefits because like the hospitality industry in the nearby community will benefit from the improvements that are made. Projects can also focus on improving environmental resource damage. A lot of the focus is around watersheds. So do we have ongoing erosion and sedimentation issues that can be fixed? Are there fish passage issues or hydrologic flow issues that could be repaired and addressed with the project? The Act also specifically talks about a shared stewardship type of a model where they really would like to see these funds leveraged and utilized. Plus, they want to see us working with partners, tribes, local governments in that shared stewardship kind of concept. And then lastly, is this a place that is really meaningful to our publics, where people will actually see and experience and utilize the improvement? So things are happening super duper fast. This timeline is biased towards what's happening with the Forest Service, but I do know DOI agencies are operating under a similar timescale. The dates may be a little different. So the legislation was signed just last August. By the end of that month, we had to submit to the Washington office the projects that we wanted to have funded in 2021. So it was very short turnaround. The legislation provided 90 days to get in front of Congress what we wanted to do. So, we have to go through our Washington office, through our department, through the Office of Management and Budget, and then to Congress. So there's a lot of overhead looking at these projects. We barely had time to breathe when in October, it was time to look at projects for 2022 funding. We had a little more time. We got through the middle of November to submit those projects, and all agencies, all 6 agencies in both departments heard about which projects would be funded in 2021 on November 12th of last year. So we got our monies in March, and so we're now starting to do some contracting, some partnership agreements, and we're starting to implement things on the ground. And beginning of this month, It is now time to think about 2023 projects and getting those submitted. So you can see that in less than 9 months, we're already into year 3 of a 5-year funding program. We have a little more time. We have until the end of August to get our projects submitted to a Washington office. We are anticipating hearing today, if we're lucky, all agencies, what projects will be funded in 2022, but we will not know about 2023 projects until at the earliest this winter or perhaps about this time next year. So what does this mean in terms of wilderness? Again, we have to focus on existing assets that have deferred maintenance, but we have those in our designated wilderness areas. So while we can't deal with the backlog of solitude monitoring or wreck site monitoring, we can look at some of our existing assets. And these would be things like trails and trail bridges and trailheads. We also have signage in wilderness, whether it's boundary, perimeter signage, signage with kiosks or interpretive signage, or perhaps signage interior to the wilderness area. Many of our wilderness areas have public use assets like cabins or guard stations or lookouts, and those would certainly qualify. And we also have a lot of historic assets that are just being maintained because of their historic value, and those often have deferred maintenance. So one way to look at things is not to do a one-off, this trail bridge, that building, but rather think about how you can combine things to really aggressively address deferred maintenance. So it could be something along the lines of, we are putting forward a project that's going to tackle the deferred maintenance to all of our historic assets within this wilderness area, or within this wilderness complex, or this combination of wilderness areas. You also can look inside and outside of your wilderness area. We are going to deal with all the trail bridge deferred maintenance in this geographic location, some of which may be inside of wilderness and some of which may be outside of wilderness. So there's a lot of different ways to be thinking about utilizing this funding source. For wild and scenic rivers, we often have additional types of existing assets that are likely to have deferred maintenance, particularly for recreational and scenic rivers that have more development along their shorelines. So here we may have boat ramps and day use sites and campgrounds that have deferred maintenance. Obviously signage. Some of our wild and scenic river corridors have roads and road bridges within them. I mentioned before about aquatic organism passage. Do we have road culverts, trail culverts, road bridges or trail bridges that are impeding aquatic organism passage or are causing sedimentation or erosion or improper hydrologic flow? These are all things that could potentially be addressed using this funding source. And then again, trails, trail bridges, trailheads, and historic assets with deferred maintenance. So again, this would be something about looking at how you can bundle projects to be really tackling deferred maintenance issues. So it could be within this wild and scenic river corridor, we're going to tackle all this deferred maintenance, or you could look at a certain kind of asset inside and outside of your wild and scenic river corridor. So many different ways of thinking about how to use this funding source. It's important to be working in an interdisciplinary manner and communicating with other people and with your unit's Great American Outdoors Act point of contact so that you really can understand and better understand how to craft projects in order to get utilize this funding source. And I know I'm a little over time, so I'm going to, if there are questions, I might be able to address those through the chat, but I want to make sure that Brenda has time to do her presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Sharon. There's currently no questions in the chat, but if one pops up, you can check it out. So thank you for that. And we've got about 6 or 7 minutes, Brenda. So take it away.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. And I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to go over a few things with you. A lot of what was covered in terms of potential funding opportunities for trails, our speakers already spoke to. So, you know, the Great American Outdoors Act funding, that's a huge source of funding for trails. And then what Randy talked about with the trail grant program, the stewardship grant program, the Forest Service Trails program has been able to fund that for the last several years. And we were able to put in, as he mentioned, $500,000 this year to be able to fund that program that they then leverage at least 6 times over with other partner contributions. So that's a huge program for us. And we're really looking forward to continuing that. So with trails, and, you know, Dusty had covered that there's the specific funding, you know, for the Wilderness Stewardship Program that Randy was also talking about. The program, Trails program, that I guess comparable and thinking about it is, we have a 10-year trail challenge that we just launched officially last year, but we're really rolling out this year. And that is effectively focusing the agency's efforts into 10 different elements of the trail program that we'll be focusing on, and then we'll be tracking our progress in each of those elements. So for example, meeting our data standards, the number of miles of trail that would be considered sustainable. So we'll be tracking those things over this next 10-year period and to be looking at our progress. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to have specific funding for that program, but for now we don't. So it's a little bit different from how the wilderness program was able to put specific funding for that. But what we've been able to do is it's called prior year funds. So essentially, if the Forest Service doesn't spend all of the appropriated money in a given fiscal year, then sometimes we get a chunk of that money back in the following fiscal year. And so for fiscal year 21, it would be considered prior year funds if it was unspent FY20 money. It's hard to believe that we have money that goes unspent, especially when we think about rec and trails. We're always, you know, trying to get as many dollars as we can, and we always feel a little bit short there. But there are some other program areas and some other reasons that we would end up getting carryover funding. So we've been really successful, and this is thank you to agency leadership for recognizing the importance of recreation and trails, that when we do get funding that is carried over from a previous year, sometimes it can be several $1,000,000. They will, instead of distributing that to all the different program areas in the Forest Service, they will try to focus some of that in recreation and trails. So we were fortunate, we got $1.8 million of carryover funding that we were able to put towards the 10-year trail challenge implementation. So this year we were able to put an extra $200,000 to every one of the 9 regions, specifically for 10-year trail challenge implementation. So we've been able to do that for a couple of years, but that's not a great budgeting process. It's just a hope that someone, you know, doesn't spend what they had and that we would get that back. So that is something we're looking at, is there some way that we can provide some consistency to be putting a focus on our 10-year trail challenge implementation to support the field in that. We were also, and actually, yes, so that carryover funding is also what enabled us to put $500,000 into that agreement with the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance to be running the Trail Stewardship Grant Program. So we also have another process that is a little bit more stable than just relying on the carryover funding, and it's called priority allocations. So it's funny, being now at the national level, this is the first time I don't actually have a budget to manage. Every other position I've been in the Forest Service, I have a pot of money that, you know, I'm responsible for distributing. At the national program level, anytime we have agreements that we would like to fund or other investments that we'd like to make, we need to go through a process with other program areas, and then our leadership will make those funding decisions on what's approved to be funded. So it's definitely accountable. It's definitely a good process. It's just new for me, but we have what's called priority allocations, and so we put in requests for, funding the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. We also were able to fund National Forest Foundation, put $500,000 into an agreement with them a couple of years ago. That is a matching program where they're looking at specific trail projects, at least 1 or 2 per region. So that is one opportunity that we have, that if things come up, we can say, yes, could we have 50,000 or 100,000 to put in this priority allocation? But those are typically smaller dollar amounts that if you're looking at the national level, they get pretty dispersed quickly. So that kind of off of that. So what we're looking at for trails projects is National Forest Foundation, again, that matching program that Kerry talked about, but we also are looking at other ways to partner with National Forest Foundation to look at leveraging some maybe more local funds and, just in a cost share agreement. So the Forest Service would ideally, put in less than 50% of the total project, and then National Forest Foundation would raise the balance of the funding. So we've been having really good conversations and ideas about that. So that's something that we're looking at the national level that would obviously roll down to the district and the forest level. And then also the Great Outdoors Fund is another source of funding. And I'm not sure how much it would apply. I would think it would apply to wilderness projects, but it's been to date kind of, I think, conceived of as helping to build a campground or do those kinds of more urban proximate type projects. But it is something to look into, the Great Outdoors Fund, which there's a database where you can enter in a project where you'd like to get funding for. And then ideally we'd have seed money already. So they could say, we're asking for $80,000 of funding and we already have 20,000 raised. So we're that close to our goal. And then other funders would be able to go to that site and say, yeah, we'd like to invest in that and get recognition for that. And then obviously there's also state level programs. So through the recreational trail program, there's federal dollars that are channeled through the states that then each state distributes out for different project proposals. So that's something that's hopefully on everybody's radar. So that's all I had, was just kind of a brief overview there, but happy to take any questions. And I do see Pete has a question about prior year funding survived in budget modernization. So that's a good question. I don't know. Through FY20, we've had the prior year come back, like into FY21, but who knows with budget modernization what that will look like. Thank you.
Answer on that prior year. I was going to try to answer that as well, but that's about how I understand it as well. So thank you, Brenda, and the rest of the presenters, and thank you for joining the class today.